One of the things that I wanted to do in The Law and Men was I wanted to highlight other works that were insightful. And along the way, I read a lot of law review articles. I came across some really great books. One of the best books that I came across was a book called Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History by Joseph W. Della Penna. Now, Della Penna is an interesting scholar. He wrote a brief in the Dobbs decision, and this was referenced by Justice Alito in the opinion. I want to read a quote from Justice Alito because he was drawing from Della Penna's works when he made this reference. But he said, not only was there no support for such a constitutional right until shortly before Roe, but abortion had long been a crime in every single state. At common law, abortion was criminal in at least some stages of pregnancy and was regarded as unlawful and could have very serious consequences at all stages. American law followed the common law until a wave of statutory restrictions in the 1800s expanded criminal liability for abortions. By the time of the adoption of the 14th Amendment, 3/4 of the states had made abortion a crime at any stage of pregnancy, and the remaining states would soon follow. Now, one might ask, why do we even care what people did in the past, at least insofar as trying to craft reasonable policies in the present is concerned? And the reason for this is that when the Supreme Court is considering the constitutionality of a piece of legislation, if they can't find a fundamental right enumerated in the Constitution, what they do is they ask if the particular statute implicates a liberty interest that had a long history in our law and in our traditions. And I'm simplifying this a little bit, but a good example of this, of course, would be a case like Crawford versus Washington. That was a case authored by Justice Scalia. And in that case, he was dealing with whether or not one had the right to confront witnesses in person. And he argued that yes, this was a fundamental right because not only is this a constitutional right, but this had a long history in the common law where people had the right to confront witnesses in person. So a similar concern occurred with all the abortion cases because there's no clearly enumerated right to an abortion. So what the court had to do in the cases dealing with this issue is they had to ask whether or not abortion had long been tolerated or considered like a common law right. What happened in Roe versus Wade, is that the court bent over backwards to find this common law right, when in reality it never really existed. But Roe, a lot of Roe was based on history, I would argue flawed history. And this is precisely the issue that's dealt with in Della Penna's book. Now, it's a huge book. It's 1,000+ pages, and it is not easy reading. I mean, he really gets in the weeds. He's got full pages of citations. Some of the pages are just a few paragraphs with everything else just citations, and it gets into very arcane statutes and case law. So again, it's not an easy read, but it's a very good read. One of the best legal books I've ever read. And I think he makes an insurmountable case that as much as some people may want to believe this idea that abortion was a common law right, or there was prior to the 1800s, there was this tolerance of abortion, it's just not correct. And he argues, but we're talking 1,000+ years of common law history. And he argues that abortion was always, in some form or fashion, illegal. Now, it is true, and he does deal with this. Abortion was not always dealt with as though it was a felony murder. And he talks about the standard that emerged in the 16 and 1700s, where in order for it to be considered a felony, the child would have had to have been born alive first and then died. But any attempt at an abortion was considered a very serious misdemeanor, or they used the word a great misprison. That was the word they used for misdemeanors in those days. But there was certainly never any kind of common law right. And he takes a lot of these silly ideas to task. There is this feminist idea that there was this sisterhood of midwives who would secretly provide abortions for women, and this was something that was kind of known, kind of secret, but kind of known, kind of tolerated. He really blows that out of the water. And one of the things I had never considered when thinking about abortion and abortion history, if you go back prior to, say, the mid-1800s, you really didn't have what would be considered safe and reliable abortion methods. When I say safe and reliable, I mean there was no way really to terminate a pregnancy without also jeopardizing the health and safety of the mother. You really don't get that until the late 1800s. So typically what you had is you had either pregnant mothers would take these kind of snake oil types of potions that were either A, ineffective, or B, they were effective, but they'd also kill or do serious harm to the mother. Back in the day, you also had situations where someone would do violence to a pregnant mother and then she would miscarry. So those were typically what you had for your abortion cases, and they were not, you don't have a voluminous body of law dealing with abortion, again, because it just wasn't that common. For people who wanted to get rid of an unwanted child, what they typically did was they just committed infanticide. So again, you go back prior to the 1800s, you have a big body of case law that deals with infanticide, but you don't have much dealing with abortion. Now, obviously, as medical science improved, you could have abortions whereby the mother wouldn't be harmed or killed. And that's when you start to see a lot of these statutes, statutes prohibiting abortion start to get adopted by the states. But there's certainly no common law right to an abortion. There's nothing deeply rooted in our history and traditions that would suggest that abortion was always tolerated. And this is one of the many reasons why I always despised the Roe versus Wade. It was an improperly decided case, regardless of how you feel about abortion from a policy standpoint. This was always just really bad law that was based on really bad history. And one of the other things that concerns me, and another issue that he deals with, this false history that the court adopted. The individuals who produced this history, he talks about an individual named Cyril Means, a scholar who was very hardcore pro-choice. The history that he concocted, it was either produced through extreme carelessness or through deliberate deception, right? There was just no basis for this history that he tried to present to the court. Unfortunately, the court bought it hook, line, and sinker. As I said, Roe is very much dependent on bad history. And that bad history was treated as though it was a given that prior to the 1800s, abortion, the right to an abortion, was just part of the rights that the people of our country and of other common law countries enjoyed, and that just wasn't the case. There were some other good issues that were dealt with in the book. He gets into this issue of what motivates abortion regulation. There's always this attempt to portray abortion regulation as really being a pretext for other things, whether it's regulating women or he deals with the so-called allopathic conspiracy. This was the idea that abortion regulation was meant to give the professional medical community more control over the field of gynecology and obstetrics. And the idea was that they were trying to usurp the role of midwives in the 1800s and professional medical people wanted to take over this area of medicine. He deals with that. I think he deals with it. I think he knocks this idea out as well. He makes a good case that that's really not what motivated abortion regulation. And to some extent, I mean, obviously, something as complicated as abortion regulation, it probably doesn't have just one motivation. But he makes a good argument that concern and the protection of unborn life was always a big part of the motivation for these abortion regulations. It's a really good book. 1,000+ pages, as I said. I have my copy here. Enormous book. I have the 2023 version. This again, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History by Joseph W. Della Penna, and this is from Carolina Academic Press. Great read. I highly recommend it.